The Zarathi Confederation had ruled the Orion Arm for 3,000 years, and their empire stretched across 40 star systems, and their military might was legendary among all species who knew of them. When they encountered humanity, they saw nothing more than another primitive species that would be easy to control and make into servants. The Zarathi had done this hundreds of times before with other worlds and other civilizations, and they expected the humans would be no different from all the others who had submitted to their power. Commander. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth, defense ship Valiant, and watched the holographic display as the alien armada materialized at the edge of the solar system like ghosts appearing from nowhere. 300 warships appeared on his screens, and each one was larger than the biggest human vessels ever constructed, and the sight of them made his blood run cold, but he kept his face calm for his crew. The message that followed was delivered in perfect English, which had been translated by their superior technology, and the voice that spoke was cold and without emotion. The alien transmission filled every screen on the bridge, and the voice said that the primitive species of the third planet from their sun would surrender all military assets immediately and prepare for integration into the Confederation. The message stated that humanity had exactly 72 hours to comply with this demand, and resistance would result in the complete annihilation of their species and the destruction of every human world. The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun and left the bridge of the Valiant in complete silence. Jake turned to his communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Rogers, who looked pale, but her jaw was set with determination. He ordered her to send the transmission directly to Earth Command immediately, and to get him a direct line to the fleet admirals as quickly as possible. Amy worked at her console with quick, precise movements, and within seconds, the message was being broadcast to every military installation in human space and to the civilian governments on Earth. Within hours, the United Earth Council convened in Geneva, and the massive chamber was filled with representatives from every nation and every colony that humanity had established among the stars. President Helen Carter sat at the head of the table, and she was surrounded by military leaders and diplomats and scientists who all looked grim. General Paul Dixon was the highest-ranking officer in Earth's defense forces, and he pulled up tactical assessments on the central display that floated above the table. Paul spoke bluntly and told the council that humanity was outgunned and outmanned and out-teched in every possible way. He explained that the Zarathi shields alone could withstand anything that human weapons could produce, and that their missiles would bounce off like toys thrown by children. The energy weapons that the aliens possessed could cut through human armor like it was paper, and their faster-than-light drives were centuries ahead of anything Earth had developed. The assessment was clear, and it was devastating, and it left no room for hope in a military solution. Ambassador Richard Cole was humanity's most experienced diplomat, and he had negotiated treaties with every human faction during the colony wars. He leaned forward and said that humanity should negotiate and buy time and find a way to coexist with the Zarathi. He argued that war with them would be suicide, and that perhaps they could find some arrangement that would allow humans to keep some autonomy. Several other diplomats nodded in agreement and suggested sending peace delegations and offering trade agreements and anything else that might avoid conflict. President Helen Carter listened to all of them, and then she spoke quietly, but her voice carried authority. She said that the Zarathi were not offering coexistence or negotiation, and they were offering slavery. The aliens had not come to talk but to conquer, and their message had been clear that submission was the only option they would accept. Helen looked around the table at every face and asked them if they were willing to become servants to an alien empire and give up everything that made humanity free. The chamber fell silent, and everyone knew what the president was saying was true. The Zarathi had not asked for peace talks or offered compromise, and they had simply demanded surrender with the threat of extinction hanging over humanity's head. The choice was clear, even if it was terrible, and humanity would either fight or they would become slaves. 72 hours passed, and during that time humanity sent dozens of diplomatic messages offering peaceful cooperation and requesting dialogue and proposing every possible alternative to war. Each message was sent with hope that perhaps the Zarathi would reconsider, or at least talk. Every single message was ignored completely, as if they had never been sent at all. The Zarathi had made their decision long before entering the solar system, and they had no interest in what the humans had to say. military installations across Earth, and Mars and the Moon worked frantically during those 3 days. Engineers pulled systems apart and rebuilt them, and scientists worked on theories that might give humanity any advantage. Soldiers said goodbye to their families, and pilots ran simulation after simulation. Everyone knew what was coming when the deadline expired, and they prepared themselves as best they could. When the 72 hours ended and the deadline passed, Admiral Lisa Harper transmitted humanity's response from Earth Command. She sat in the deep command center buried beneath the Atlantic Ocean, and her face appeared on screens across human space and in the Zarathi flagship. Her voice was steady and cold as the void of space itself, and she looked directly into the camera. Lisa said that the Zarathi Confederation had demanded surrender and threatened extinction, and that humanity had tried peace and offered friendship. She paused and then said that the Zarathi had chosen war, and that was their decision to make. Her next words became the rallying cry for everything that followed, and they were repeated across every human world. She said, "Very well, and since you chose war, let us show you how it's done." The transmission ended, and across human space, every military installation went dark. Every ship powered down its transponders and communication systems. The solar system became a black void on Zarathi sensors, as if every human had simply vanished. Space stations that had been broadcasting constantly went silent. Defense platforms that had been tracking the alien fleet disappeared from all scans. It was as if humanity had simply ceased to exist. On the Zarathi flagship, Supreme Warlord Thexus watched the human disappearance with amusement. He stood in his command center, which was larger than most human buildings, and he was surrounded by officers who served him without question. He told his subordinates that the humans were hiding like prey animals, and that they had realized the futility of resistance. He ordered the fleet to begin the invasion and to show the humans the price of their defiance, even if it had only lasted a few moments. The Zarathi fleet moved forward in perfect formation, and their ships glowed with power and confidence. They had conquered hundreds of worlds and defeated thousands of enemies, and they had never been truly challenged. These humans would be no different from all the others, and by tomorrow, their world would belong to the Confederation. Thexus settled into his command throne and prepared to watch another easy victory and add another species to the long list of those who had fallen before Zarathi might. The Zarathi fleet moved in perfect formation toward Earth, and their confidence was absolute, because they had never faced a species that could challenge them. Their sensors showed no resistance ahead and no ships rising to meet them, and the humans had gone completely silent. Supreme Warlord Thexus believed the humans had abandoned their military infrastructure and were cowering on their planet waiting for the inevitable conquest. He had seen this pattern before with other species who realized too late that they could not win against Zarathi. Power. Captain Greg Palmer commanded the Earth defense ship, Horizon, and it was one of 50 vessels, hiding in the asteroid belt beyond Mars. His crew sat in complete darkness, and life support was running at minimum levels, and every system that could emit energy was powered down to nothing. They had been waiting like this for 3 days and drifting through space like dead metal and ice. The crew communicated only through hand signals and written notes, because even radio waves might give away their position. "Lieutenant." Ben Taylor was at the sensor station, and he whispered that the Zarathi vanguard was entering the kill box. He was reading only passive sensors, which meant detecting the enemy by the radiation they naturally emitted rather than actively scanning them. The tactical display showed the alien ships moving past Mars, in a tight formation and heading straight for Earth. They were grouped together with their shields overlapping in a standard formation that showed they expected no real opposition. Greg watched the display and felt his heart pounding, but his hands were steady. He opened a tightly focused transmission channel to the other hidden ships and said that weapons would be free in 10 seconds. He ordered all ships to target the rear vessels first, and to make every shot count, because they would only get one chance at surprise. The countdown began, and every captain in the hidden fleet prepared their crews for what was about to happen. Humanity had spent those 72 hours doing more than just sending diplomatic messages that were ignored. Human engineers had worked without sleeping, and scientists had pushed theories to their limits, and military planners had created something desperate and dangerous. They could not match alien shields or energy weapons, but they understood one fundamental truth that the Zarathi had forgotten. Physics worked the same for everyone, regardless of how advanced their technology was. The human ships came alive all at once like a pack of wolves springing a trap. Nuclear-armed missile pods that had been drifting through space disguised as debris suddenly activated their engines. Railguns that had been hidden among the asteroids locked onto targets and began charging. 50 warships lit their fusion drives and accelerated to attack speed in just seconds. The sudden appearance of so many targets caused confusion in the Zarathi formation. The Zarathi detected the ambush instantly, but by then it was already too late to avoid it. The first wave of missiles struck the rearmost alien ships, and these were not conventional warheads at all. Human scientists had developed something new during those desperate hours, and they were kinetic penetrators wrapped around antimatter cores. The missiles were designed to punch through shields using pure velocity before detonating inside the enemy ships. The result was absolutely devastating. 6 Zarathi warships disappeared in brilliant explosions that lit up space like newborn stars. Their shields had held against the initial impact, but the antimatter detonation from inside had torn them apart. The other alien ships began to turn and bring their weapons to bear, but the human fleet was already scattering. Every ship broke into individual attack patterns that made no tactical sense by any conventional military doctrine. On the Zarathi flagship, Thexus roared orders at his bridge crew. He commanded all ships to form a defensive formation and bring shields to maximum power and destroy those primitive vessels. His officers scrambled to obey, but they were confused because the human ships were not moving like military vessels should. Each ship operated independently and followed patterns that seemed random and chaotic. The humans were not fighting a conventional battle at all. Every ship moved guided by artificial intelligence that calculated millions of trajectories every second. They danced through space like small fighters rather than capital ships, and they were never where the Zarathi predicted they would be. Computer systems managed every movement with precision that no organic brain could match, and the result was beautiful and deadly chaos. Commander Susan Knight piloted the destroyer Spearhead through a gap in the enemy formation, and her helmsman Danny Murphy executed maneuvers that should have torn the ship apart from the forces involved. They released a spread of nuclear mines behind them, and each mine was programmed to activate when enemy shields passed within detonation range. The mines drifted like seeds waiting to bloom into fire. Danny called out that the aliens were adapting to their tactics, and Zarathi energy beams were lancing through space closer to where they actually were. Susan replied calmly that humans were adapting too, and she keyed the fleet channel. She ordered all ships to implement Pattern Delta, and said they would show the Zarathi what unpredictable really meant. Her voice was steady even though her ship was being shot at by weapons that could vaporize them. Across the battlefield, human ships began implementing completely randomized attack patterns. The AI systems coordinated their chaos and ensured that ships never collided with each other, while maintaining maximum aggression against the enemy. It was a strategy the Zarathi had never encountered because it relied on computer precision that no organic crew could manage. The patterns changed every few seconds, and no 2 ships moved the same way. More alien ships began falling to the human assault. The Zarathi were losing ships and taking damage, and they could not understand why these primitives were winning. Their shields were stronger and their weapons were more powerful, and their ships were larger, but none of that mattered. The humans fought like nothing they had ever seen before, and conventional tactics meant nothing against such chaos. Greg Palmer brought the Horizon around for another attack run, and his weapons officer launched a full spread of railgun rounds at a Zarathi cruiser. The tungsten penetrators moved at a fraction of light speed and carried so much kinetic energy that they glowed white-hot. 3 rounds missed, but 2 struck home and punched through the alien shields through sheer momentum. The cruiser's hull ruptured and it began spinning out of control. Ben Taylor reported that they had destroyed 20 enemy ships and damaged 40 more in just 2 hours of fighting. The Zarathi fleet was trying to pull back and reform, but Admiral Lisa Harper had no intention of allowing them any time to recover. From her command center deep beneath Earth's oceans, she coordinated the next phase of the attack. Lisa opened a channel to all ground-based installations on Earth and the Moon and Mars. She told them to prepare to fire on her mark, and she watched the tactical display with cold calculation. She waited for the perfect moment as the Zarathi fleet tried to retreat into a defensive formation. The aliens were moving exactly where she wanted them to be. On Earth's surface and on lunar bases and Martian outposts, massive railgun installations came online. These weapons had been built in secret over the past decade under the cover of civilian mining operations. They were disguised as ore processors and cargo launchers, But their true purpose was now revealed. Each railgun was as large as an office building and required enough power to light an entire city. Colonel Matt Jenkins commanded Lunar Fire Base 7, and he watched his gun crews work with the efficiency that came from years of training. They loaded tungsten telephone poles into the massive cannon and prepared to fire. Each shot would cost enough energy to power a small city for a week, but they had been stockpiling power for this moment for years. The lunar railguns fired in sequence and sent their projectiles screaming toward the retreating Zarathi fleet. At such extreme velocities, the tungsten rounds carried kinetic energy equivalent to nuclear weapons. Even the advanced Zarathi shields struggled against projectiles moving at such incredible speeds. When the rounds hit, they registered as small nuclear detonations on every sensor. Sergeant Nina Brooks called out that the target was destroyed, and she immediately began calculating the firing solution for the next hostile ship. Her fingers moved across her console with practiced speed, and the next round was already being loaded. The gun crews worked like machines themselves and maintained a firing rate that would have seemed impossible during peacetime exercises. Thexus realized with horror that he had fallen directly into a carefully planned trap. The human fleet had driven his ships into a predetermined kill zone where fixed installations could fire with devastating accuracy. His formation was being torn apart by weapons that his intelligence reports had said did not exist. The humans had been hiding their true capabilities and waiting for exactly this moment. Supreme Warlord Thexus watched his fleet's casualties mount with growing disbelief and rage that he could barely control. 20 ships had been completely destroyed, and 40 more were damaged badly enough that they could not fight effectively. The humans were supposed to be primitive and barely capable of leaving their own planet, and yet they fought with a ferocity that defied every intelligence report his scouts had provided. His officers stood at their stations in stunned silence because they had never seen their mighty fleet take such losses. Thexus gave the order to pull back to defensive range and reform the fleet because they needed to reassess the situation. His pride was wounded, but his survival instinct was stronger, and he knew continuing the assault without understanding the enemy would lead to more losses. The Zarathi ships began to retreat in an organized pattern with their shields at maximum and their weapons still firing to cover their withdrawal. It was the first time in 3,000 years that a Zarathi fleet had retreated from a battle. Admiral Lisa Harper sat in her command center far beneath the Atlantic Ocean and watched the enemy fleet trying to regroup. She had no intention of allowing them any time to reassess or recover from their losses. Her fingers moved across her control console, and she opened channels to every remaining installation that had not yet fired. Her voice was calm and measured when she spoke, and she told all ground-based installations to fire on her mark. Lisa watched the tactical display with the patience of a hunter waiting for prey to step into the perfect position. The Zarathi fleet was pulling back and trying to reform their formation, and they were moving exactly where she had predicted they would. Years of military training and months of planning had led to this exact moment. She waited 3 more seconds and then gave the command to fire. On Earth and the Moon and Mars, massive railgun installations that had been silent until now suddenly came to life. The weapons had been constructed in secret over an entire decade, and they had been disguised as civilian infrastructure and mining operations. Governments had poured resources into building them, while telling the public they were just industrial equipment. Now their true purpose was finally revealed to the galaxy. The railguns fired in carefully timed sequence and sent tungsten projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed toward the retreating alien fleet. At those extreme velocities, even the advanced Zarathi shields struggled to dissipate the kinetic energy. The projectiles carried so much momentum that impacts registered as small nuclear detonations on every sensor in the system. Each shot was precisely calculated to hit targets at their weakest shield points. Colonel Matt Jenkins stood in the control room of Lunar Fire Base 7 and watched his gun crews work with practiced efficiency that came from endless drills. They loaded massive tungsten penetrators into the railgun and fired every 45 seconds like clockwork. Each shot required enormous amounts of energy that had been stored in capacitor banks over months of careful preparation. The lunar surface shook slightly with each firing, and dust was thrown up around the installation. Sergeant Nina Brooks called out that another target was destroyed, and she immediately shifted to the next designated hostile without pausing. Her targeting computer fed her constant updates on enemy positions and shield status and probable weak points. She had been doing this job for 6 hours straight without rest, and her accuracy had not dropped even slightly. The adrenaline and determination kept her focused despite exhaustion. Thexus realized too late that his tactical withdrawal had moved his fleet directly into another predetermined kill zone. The human commander had predicted his response and laid another trap that he had walked right into. His ships were being systematically destroyed by weapons firing from multiple angles and ranges. The coordination required for such an attack was something he had not believed. The humans capable of achieving the Supreme Warlord gave an emergency order for all ships to execute faster than light jumps immediately. His fleet would retreat to Rally Point Gamma and regroup there before attempting another assault. The jump drives on his remaining ships began charging and creating the dimensional distortions needed to escape normal space. It would take 60 seconds for the drives to reach full charge and create stable jump corridors. The humans had planned for that possibility too. As the Zarathi ships began charging their jump drives, small human attack craft that had been hiding among the orbital debris suddenly activated. These fighters were tiny compared to the massive warships, but each one carried a single experimental weapon. Human scientists had developed gravity disruptors that could destabilize jump field formation and cause catastrophic drive failures. Lieutenant Chris Allen piloted his fighter straight into the heart of the enemy formation, with his hands steady on the controls despite the terror flooding through him. Alien point defense weapons fired at his small craft and missed by meters because he was moving in unpredictable evasive patterns. He reached the optimal position and triggered the gravity disruptor, and immediately broke away at maximum acceleration. The effect was immediate and devastating. 20 Zarathi vessels that had been attempting to jump suddenly found their drives catastrophically failing. The dimensional distortions collapsed inward instead of forming stable corridors, and the feedback energy had nowhere to go. 3 ships exploded instantly from the massive energy release, and the others were left dead in space with their primary systems completely overloaded and burned out. Greg Palmer transmitted from the horizon to all human ships and told them to close for the kill. The human fleet swept in like a pack of wolves descending on wounded prey. Their weapons fired continuously, and their targeting computers picked apart the disabled enemy vessels. There was no mercy in their assault because they knew the Zarathi would have shown them none. The battle continued for 6 more hours of brutal close-range combat. Human ships darted in and out of weapons range and used every trick they had learned. Zarathi vessels fought desperately, but they were disorganized and their formation was shattered. Ship after ship fell to the relentless human assault until finally the survivors managed to jump away to safety. When the fighting finally ended, 2/3 of the Zarathi vanguard had been destroyed or captured. The remainder had escaped to the outer system with their confidence and pride completely shattered. They had come to conquer a primitive species, and instead they had been handed the worst defeat in Zarathi military history. The survivors sent desperate messages back to their homeworlds describing an enemy unlike anything they had encountered before. On Earth, billions of people watched the broadcasts from the battlefield with emotions, ranging from awe to horror. They had won this first major engagement, but the cost had been severe and everyone understood that. 18 human ships had been completely destroyed and thousands of crew members were dead. Entire families had lost loved ones and the celebrations were muted by grief. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Guardian and looked at the casualty reports with a heavy heart. He had known many of the officers who had died and their faces haunted him. Amy Rogers worked quietly at her station, and her eyes were red from crying, but her hands never stopped moving. They both knew this was just the beginning of a much longer war. The defense fleet began recovery operations and rescue teams searched through debris fields for survivors. Medical ships moved among the wreckage and pulled injured crew members from damaged vessels. Engineers assessed which ships could be repaired and which were total losses. The solar system had become a graveyard, but it was a graveyard filled with mostly alien dead. Admiral Lisa Harper reviewed the battle reports and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before turning to the next problem. The Zarathi would return with greater numbers and better preparation, and humanity needed to be ready. She opened communication channels to military research facilities and ordered them to analyze every piece of captured alien technology. Every advantage they could gain might mean the difference between survival and extinction. Dr. Frank Morrison led a research team that was studying a damaged Zarathi vessel that had been captured intact. His team worked around the clock examining alien systems and trying to understand technology that was centuries ahead of human science. Every discovery was immediately shared with military planners who looked for ways to exploit weaknesses or adapt alien concepts to human use. The war was far from over, and everyone knew the Zarathi Empire would respond to this humiliation with overwhelming force. The Confederation had resources from 40 star systems and a military tradition spanning millennia. They would not accept defeat from a species they considered primitive. The question was not if they would return, but when and with how many ships. The defeat of the Zarathi vanguard sent shockwaves through the Confederation that reached every corner of their empire. For the first time in thousands of years, their military had been humiliated by a species they considered primitive and barely worthy of notice. The response from the Confederation Council was predictable and terrible, and it came swiftly with all the fury of wounded pride. The Confederation Council convened on their capital, world of Zarathus Prime, in a massive chamber that had witnessed 3 millennia of imperial decisions. High Commander Vexel stood before the assembled leadership, and his voice trembled with barely controlled rage. He declared that the humans must be made an example that would echo across the galaxy for generations. No species would ever dare to resist Confederation authority again after what would be done to Earth. Vexel proposed dispatching the 6th Fleet, which was one of the largest military formations in Zarathi history. 1,000 warships would be sent to the human system, with orders to sterilize their worlds completely. There would be no negotiations and no mercy, and nothing would be left but ash and radiation. The Council voted unanimously to approve the plan because their pride demanded that humanity pay the ultimate price for their defiance. Back in the solar system, humanity prepared for the storm they all knew was coming. Admiral Lisa Harper coordinated the construction of new defenses while scientists worked around the clock to analyze every piece of captured Zarathi technology. Every fragment of alien hull metal and every damaged system was studied in hopes of finding new weaknesses to exploit. The entire human civilization shifted to a war footing. Dr. Frank Morrison led the primary research team, studying a damaged alien vessel that had been towed to a hidden research station beyond Neptune. His daughter, Captain Jennifer Morrison, provided security for the facility with a company of elite soldiers. Frank spent 18 hours a day examining alien systems, and his team made breakthrough after breakthrough as they unlocked secrets of technology far beyond human capability. Frank explained to the military observers that Zarathi shields worked on principles that human science barely understood. The aliens used quantum field manipulation to create barriers that could stop almost any attack. However, his team had found a critical weakness in the shield design. The shields were incredibly sophisticated and filtered out everything below a certain velocity threshold to allow for normal ship operations like docking, procedures, and debris management. General Paul Dixon asked exactly how slow the projectiles would need to be to pass through the shields undetected. Frank replied that they would need to move at walking speed or slower to avoid triggering the shield's defensive response. The shields were designed to stop fast-moving threats like missiles and energy beams, but they essentially ignored anything moving slowly because the aliens never imagined such an attack. That discovery led to the rapid development of a new weapon system that engineers called crawlers. These were small autonomous drones that would attach to enemy hulls at minimal velocity and then burrow through the armor using high-powered cutting lasers. Once inside, they could sabotage critical systems or detonate small nuclear charges that would tear the ship apart from within. It was a weapon that relied on patience rather than speed. Humanity had 2 months before the Zarathi 6th Fleet would arrive at the edge of the solar system. They used every single second of that time to prepare. Shipyards worked constantly and produced new vessels while old ones were retrofitted with captured alien technology. Soldiers trained in tactics that had worked before and practiced new ones that might work next time. Every resource humanity possessed was poured into the war effort. Commander Jake Morrison received a promotion after the first battle and now commanded the Earth Defense Ship Guardian. He worked closely with Lieutenant Amy Rogers to train new crews in the unconventional tactics that had won the first engagement. They ran simulation after simulation and drilled the crews until they could execute complex maneuvers in their sleep. Jake told the assembled captains that the moment they fought the Zarathi way, they would lose because humanity's only advantage was unpredictability. When the Zarathi 6th Fleet finally emerged at the edge of the solar system. Their arrival was like a dark cloud covering the stars. 1,000 warships appeared on human sensors, and the sight of them filled everyone with dread. The fleet was so large that it took hours just for all the ships to complete their jump into normal space. Supreme Commander Vexil personally led the fleet from his massive flagship, and he had studied the human tactics carefully. The Zarathi came prepared this time with their formation widely dispersed to prevent ambushes. Their shields had been modified to better defend against the kinetic weapons that had caused so much damage in the first battle. Their sensors swept constantly for hidden threats, and they advanced slowly and cautiously. Vexil believed he understood the human tricks now, and he was confident that overwhelming numbers would prevail. The battle began not with weapons but with information warfare. Human hackers led by civilian expert Casey Turner had spent 2 months analyzing captured Zarathi communication protocols and computer systems. When the alien fleet entered the system, they were immediately hit with a massive barrage of electronic attacks. Spoofed sensor data filled their displays, and false targeting information confused their weapons operators, and communication jamming prevented proper coordination. The Zarathi fleet found itself effectively blind and confused within minutes of entering the system. Their sensors showed human ships that did not actually exist while missing real threats entirely. Captains received contradictory orders that seemed to come from their commanders, but were actually fabricated by human AI systems. Several friendly fire incidents erupted as confused alien crews fired on what they thought were enemies but were actually their own ships. Lisa Harper waited until the confusion reached its peak, and then gave the order for the real attack to begin. Human ships that had been hiding throughout the system suddenly appeared and struck from multiple vectors simultaneously. Ships equipped with the new crawler drones made close passes at enemy vessels and deployed thousands of the small machines. Meanwhile, long-range railgun fire kept the enemy off balance and prevented them from organizing an effective response. Captain Susan Knight commanded a squadron of destroyers that specialized in hit-and-run tactics using captured alien jump drives. They would materialize in-system at close range to enemy ships and fire everything they had before jumping back out to safety. Her helmsman Danny Murphy had become an expert at calculating jump coordinates that brought them out exactly where they needed to. Danny counted down the jump sequence, and the spearhead along with her entire squadron materialized just 500 kilometers from a Zarathi battle group. They fired a devastating salvo of nuclear-tipped missiles and railgun rounds that caught the aliens completely by surprise. Before the enemy could respond with return fire, the human ships vanished back into faster-than-light space and reappeared elsewhere to strike again. The battle raged for 2 full weeks of constant fighting. The Zarathi had overwhelming numbers, but humanity had determination and creativity that kept producing new surprises. Every day brought new tactics and new weapons and new ways to make the aliens pay dearly for every meter of space they advanced toward. Earth, human casualties mounted, but so did alien losses. Colonel Matt Jenkins and his gun crews on Luna fought until their railguns were glowing red-hot from constant use. Ammunition stockpiles that were supposed to last months were exhausted in days. Sergeant Nina Brooks calculated firing solutions in her head when the targeting computers overheated and failed, and her accuracy remained perfect. Even under extreme exhaustion and stress, the crawler drones proved devastatingly effective. They attached to Zarathi hulls by the thousands and began cutting through armor that had been designed to withstand direct hits from capital ship weapons. The aliens had no defense against such a slow, methodical attack. Ships began experiencing catastrophic system failures as the crawlers reached critical components and destroyed them. Nuclear detonations tore apart vessels from inside where their shields could not protect them. But despite all of humanity's clever tactics and desperate courage, the tide was slowly turning against them. The Zarathi were learning from each engagement and adapting their defenses. Their officers were competent, and their resources seemed endless. For every alien ship destroyed, 2 more took its position. The mathematical reality was becoming clear that humanity could not win through tactics alone. The war entered its 4th month, and the Zarathi's 6th fleet had finally reached Earth's orbital space after fighting through every defensive line humanity could establish. Despite horrific casualties that would have broken any other military force, they had pressed forward relentlessly through every trap and ambush. Now 300 alien ships hung in formation above, humanity's homeworld like executioners preparing for the final blow, and their Weapons were charged and ready to begin planetary bombardment. On Earth, billions of people waited in underground shelters and reinforced bunkers with fear gripping their hearts. The defense fleets had been shattered in weeks of constant fighting, and ammunition stockpiles were nearly exhausted. Every trick and tactic had been used, and the Zarathi had adapted to all of them. Hope seemed lost, and many believed this was humanity's final day. Children clung to their parents, and soldiers checked their weapons one last time, knowing they would die fighting. Admiral Lisa Harper sat in her command center deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean and looked at the tactical displays with grim determination. She had one final card to play, and it was the most desperate gamble in human history. If it failed, then humanity would be exterminated, but if they did nothing, the result would be exactly the same. The plan had been developed in absolute secrecy over the past month, and only a handful of people knew it existed. In the final weeks of the war, while battles raged across the solar system, human scientists had achieved a breakthrough that changed everything. Dr. Frank Morrison and his research team had successfully reverse-engineered the Zarathi faster-than-light drive technology. More importantly, they had discovered a way to weaponize the fundamental principles that made interstellar travel possible. The mathematics were elegant and terrible in equal measure. Frank explained the concept to military command in a presentation that lasted 3 hours. The weapon was called the Einstein Protocol, and it would create an artificial gravity well that would tear apart anything with an active jump drive within its effective radius. The gravitational distortion would cause every faster-than-light engine to catastrophically fail and implode. The problem was that the weapon could not distinguish between enemy and friendly vessels, and it would destroy every ship with an active drive, including humanity's captured alien technology. General Paul Dixon listened to the explanation and understood immediately what Frank was proposing. He said quietly that humanity would not need those captured drives if the plan worked, because the war would be over. If the plan failed, then everyone would be dead anyway, and it would not matter. The logic was brutal but undeniable, and there were no other options left. The plan was refined over days of frantic preparation. Every remaining human ship that had been equipped with a captured alien drive would be loaded with nuclear weapons and programmed to jump directly into the heart of the enemy formation. At the precise moment they materialized, the ground-based installations would activate the Einstein Protocol. The resulting gravity anomaly would cause every active drive in the entire battlespace to fail catastrophically. The timing had to be perfect because the human crews needed exactly enough time to evacuate into escape pods before their ships jumped. If they jumped too early, the crews would die, and if they waited too long, the Zarathi would destroy them before they could execute. The margin for error was measured in seconds, and there would be no second chance. Volunteers were called for, and every single surviving captain stepped forward. Captain Greg Palmer volunteered to lead the suicide squadron without hesitation. He stood on the bridge of the horizon with his skeleton crew, and all of them were volunteers who understood they might not survive what was about to happen. The ship was loaded with enough nuclear weapons to crack a small moon, and her captured alien drive was programmed for a one-way jump into the center of the enemy fleet. Greg opened a channel to all the ships in the suicide squadron, and his voice was steady despite the fear he felt. He said that all ships were ready and coordinates were locked, and he hoped they would all meet again on the other side. Around him, his crew made their final preparations and checked their escape pod systems one last time. They had minutes before the attack would begin. Jake Morrison commanded the Guardian as part of the evacuation fleet that would rescue any survivors from the attack. His ship hung back at maximum safe distance with its rescue systems primed and ready. Amy Rogers coordinated the extraction teams, and her voice remained steady despite the impossible pressure. She knew that many of the people about to jump into danger would not be coming back. Supreme Commander Vexel stood on his flagship bridge and watched his fleet prepare to bombard Earth's surface into radioactive slag. His sensors detected unusual activity among the remaining human ships, but he dismissed it as desperate final resistance. The humans were beaten, and this was just their death throes. He gave the order to begin bombardment, and his weapons officers prepared to fire. 50 human vessels materialized simultaneously throughout the Zarathi formation, like ghosts appearing from nowhere. The aliens had only seconds to react before the Einstein Protocol activated from ground installations across Earth and Luna and Mars. Reality itself seemed to twist and bend as artificial gravity wells formed throughout the battle space, every faster than light. Drive in the area began tearing itself apart as the fundamental physics that allowed them to function were violently disrupted. The effect cascaded through the Zarathi fleet like a plague. Ships imploded as their drives collapsed inward or exploded as containment fields failed catastrophically. Some vessels simply tore themselves in half as gravitational shear forces exceeded their structural limits. The human ships that had jumped into the formation were destroyed along with their targets exactly as planned. But their crews had evacuated seconds before the jump, and their escape pods tumbled through space as the vessels they had served on disintegrated. The sacrifice was not in vain because the Zarathi Sixth Fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force in less than 10 minutes. Greg Palmer's escape pod spun wildly through the debris field as the horizon exploded behind him in a bloom of nuclear fire. He could see other pods around him and the massive detonations as Zarathi ships died by the dozens. His pod systems were damaged and he lost consciousness as acceleration forces overwhelmed his body. His last thought was that they had actually done it. Jake Morrison ordered his rescue teams to sweep through the expanding debris field and pull survivors from the wreckage. Shuttles and small craft darted between chunks of destroyed ships looking for escape pods and life signs. They found Greg unconscious but alive along with 60% of the Suicide Squadron's crews. It was a far higher survival rate than anyone had dared to hope for. The battle was over in less than an hour. The Zarathi fleet that had come to exterminate humanity had been exterminated instead. Only a handful of alien ships on the outer edges of the formation had survived, and they immediately jumped away to carry news of the disaster back to their empire. 3 fleets had been sent against Earth and 3 fleets had been destroyed. On Zarathus Prime, the Confederation Council received the news in absolute stunned silence. High Commander Vexel stood before them with his career in ruins and admitted what no Zarathi had ever said before. He told them that the humans fought like no species they had ever encountered. They accepted casualties that would shatter any civilized military, and they used tactics that bordered on insanity. They weaponized concepts the Zarathi had never imagined could be weapons. To defeat humanity, the Confederation would have to become like them, and that was a price too terrible to pay. 3 weeks later, a Zarathi ambassador delivered a message to Earth through neutral intermediaries. It was not a formal surrender because the proud Confederation could never admit defeat, but it was an acknowledgement of reality wrapped in diplomatic language. The Zarathi would withdraw from human space permanently and recognize humanity's borders. There would be peace because the alternative was mutual destruction that served no one. Admiral Lisa Harper read the message in her command center surrounded by her exhausted staff. The room erupted in cheers and tears of relief because they had survived against impossible odds. She allowed herself a small smile before turning to the enormous task of rebuilding. The war had cost millions of lives and the scars would take generations to heal. Reconstruction efforts began immediately across the solar system. Shipyards that had built warships started producing civilian vessels again. Engineers who had designed weapons turned their skills toward building homes. Soldiers returned to their families and tried to forget the horrors they had seen. Humanity had been tested in the fires of war and emerged as a power that could never be ignored. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the rebuilt Guardian looking out at the stars that seemed somehow different now. Amy Rogers joined him quietly and they stood together in comfortable silence. She asked if he thought the Zarathi would ever return, and Jake considered the question carefully. He said maybe they would, but humanity would be ready, and next time they would show them something new. The promise was quiet but absolute.